This story begins not in a palace, nor in the corridors of power, but in a quiet corner of rural France. The year was 1902. The world was stepping into a new century of machines, progress, and turmoil. But in the countryside of the village of Chateauneuf, life still moved with the rhythm of the earth, the plow cutting furrows, the bells ringing from the village chapel, the seasons dictating the pace of survival. In a simple farmhouse, built of rough stone and timber, a child was born, Marthe Robin. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about her birth. No signs in the sky, no predictions of greatness. She came into the world like millions of other children, frail, small, but with eyes that glimmered with life. Her family was poor, tied to the soil. Days were spent laboring in fields, evenings by the fire with simple meals of bread and soup. For the Robins, survival was not guaranteed. The earth was generous at times, merciless at others. Yet in that environment, Marthe learned something profound: humility, simplicity, and a quiet acceptance of hardship. As a little girl, Marthe loved the fields. She would watch the wind ripple through the wheat, listen to the church bell echo across the valley, and whisper prayers in her childlike voice. For her, the world was alive with mystery. Every dawn was a painting, every dusk a hymn. But the brightness of her childhood did not last. In her teenage years, illness struck. At first, it was fatigue. She stumbled when she walked, struggled with tasks others found simple. Then came weakness, spreading like a shadow through her body. Doctors in the village were puzzled. They spoke of encephalitis, of damage to her nervous system, but their words offered no cure. Marthe's world began to shrink. The wide fields where she once ran gave way to the small rooms of her home. Eventually, even those rooms narrowed into a single space: her bed. By the age of 21, she was partially paralyzed. Soon, blindness would follow. By her 30s, she could not move, could not see, could not leave her darkened room. And yet, in that confinement, something strange happened. What could have been a prison became a chapel. What could have been despair became a school of grace. Her family and neighbors saw only a bedridden girl, wasting away in silence. But in Marthe's heart, prayer bloomed like a secret garden. She spoke to God as if He were seated beside her. She confided her fears, her pain, and her longing. The child who once whispered prayers in the fields now whispered them in the shadows, unseen, unheard, but not unnoticed. There is something profoundly cinematic in this image. A frail young woman, trapped in a farmhouse room, surrounded by shadows, yet her spirit beginning to burn with invisible light. Outside, the world plunged into wars and revolutions. Inside, in hidden France, a girl was preparing for a mission that would one day ripple across nations. Her body weakened, but her soul grew fierce. She surrendered to God, not with grand speeches, but with the quiet acceptance of each day, each hour, each breath. To Marthe, suffering was not an enemy to be fought, but a cross to be carried. As the years went on, visitors would later recall stepping into her room and feeling something unusual. Even in her early years of illness, they described a presence, an atmosphere of peace, as though the air itself was heavy with prayer. Marthe had not yet revealed the full mystery of her calling, but already her life had taken a turn away from the ordinary. The fields of Chateauneuf de Galora, once alive with her laughter, now knew her absence. The farmhouse walls, once echoing with her footsteps, now enclosed her silence. And yet, within that silence, history was being shaped. For here was a girl who could no longer walk, no longer see, and yet would one day influence priests, bishops, and even popes. Here was a fragile flower, cut off from the sunlight, but destined to radiate a light brighter than the sun. And so the curtain falls on the first act of her story. But this was only the beginning. because in that darkness, the flame of a mystic was being lit. The farmhouse was not large, but for Marthe Robin, one room in that house became her entire world. As her illness tightened its grip, her universe narrowed to a single bed, a small table, and a crucifix that hung on the wall opposite her pillow. By her early 20s, she was almost completely paralyzed. Yet even in this darkness, she remained startlingly aware. She heard the whispers of her family. She recognized the creak of the farmhouse floorboards. And above all, she felt the unspoken weight of her suffering pressing upon her. For most people, this would have been the end of a story. A young life broken, dreams buried under the cruel weight of disease. But for Marthe, the story was only beginning. She faced a choice every day: despair or surrender. The despair was easy. It sat at the edge of her bed like a shadow, whispering that her life was meaningless. But Marthe chose surrender. She began to see her suffering not as punishment, but as participation in a greater mystery, the cross of Christ. Night after night, she prayed in silence. Sometimes her lips moved, sometimes her heart prayed without words. She offered her pain as if it were a kind of currency, trading her weakness for strength in the lives of others. Lord, if this is your will, then let it be for souls. Visitors who came to the farmhouse during those years often expected to find a broken girl drowning in misery. Instead, they found a strange radiance. Her face, though pale and thin, carried a peace that unsettled those who looked at her too long. She spoke little, but her words carried weight. She seemed to listen more than she talked, listening not just to people, but to something deeper, as though every pause in conversation was filled with an invisible dialogue between her soul and God. Marthe's room became more than a bedroom. It became a sanctuary. Her bed became an altar of hidden sacrifice, and her silence became a kind of sermon, louder than words. But her union with Christ did not remain only interior. Soon, physical signs began to appear. On Fridays, her body seemed to relive the passion of Jesus. She would writhe in pain, whispering fragments of prayer, her face reflecting agony and love all at once. Some reported seeing wounds on her hands and feet, the stigmata, the mysterious marks of Christ's crucifixion. Whether visible or hidden, the suffering was real. Marthe became, in a sense, a living image of Calvary. It is difficult to capture this in words without slipping into exaggeration. And yet the testimonies remain consistent. Something beyond the natural was happening in that room. A frail woman, blind and paralyzed, carried within her flesh and spirit the drama of the Passion. And still, she never sought attention. She did not call herself holy, did not announce miracles. When people asked how she endured, she would smile faintly and answer, "It is not I, but Christ who lives in me." The villagers began to sense that something extraordinary was hidden in their midst. Farmers, schoolchildren, even priests would make the quiet pilgrimage up the hill to the Robin farmhouse. They did not come for spectacle. They came because in that darkened room, they felt the presence of God. Imagine it cinematically. The outside world rushing with wars, revolutions, the rise of modernity, and in the middle of it, a silent farmhouse with a woman lying in bed, unseen, unknown, yet mysteriously at the center of something immense. Her body was ruined, but her spirit was aflame. Marthe Robin had become a paradox, a prisoner who was more free than many kings, a blind woman who saw more clearly than most, a weak girl who carried strength greater than armies. The illness had stolen everything from her: her sight, her movement, her independence. But in giving her nothing, it gave her everything: a cross to carry, a place at the very heart of Christ's Passion. By the late 1920s, her reputation was beginning to spread. Priests whispered about her endurance. Doctors puzzled over her survival. Ordinary villagers knelt by her bedside to ask for prayers. And all the while, Marthe remained the same, silent, fragile, luminous. Her story was moving into its next stage. For in 1930, something would happen that defied explanation. Marthe Robin would cease to eat and drink entirely, sustained only by the Eucharist. The illness that had already confined her would now become the stage for one of the most astonishing mysteries of modern times. The year was 1930. By now, Marthe Robin had been paralyzed for years, her eyesight all but gone, her body reduced to frailty. The doctors could no longer explain her survival. She ate almost nothing, drank almost nothing, yet her heart continued to beat. And then, something happened that would leave even skeptics speechless. Marthe stopped taking food and water altogether. From that year until her death in 1981, half a century later, she lived solely on the Eucharist. Every Friday, a priest would enter her darkened room. The world outside moved with its usual rhythm: farmers plowing, children laughing, markets buzzing. But inside, time seemed to stop. The priest would place the small white host on her tongue, and Marthe would receive the body of Christ. This was her only nourishment. No bread, no water, no medicine. Just the Eucharist. Witnesses testified that in those moments, her face would light up. The pallor of illness seemed to fade for a brief instant, replaced by something almost radiant. It was as though her soul drank what her body could not, and the presence of Christ filled her with a strength no earthly food could provide. But the Eucharist was not only her sustenance. It became the stage of her mystical union with Christ's passion. On Fridays, her room transformed into a kind of living Calvary. Marthe would relive the sufferings of Jesus in her own flesh. Her body, so fragile it could barely move, would suddenly be racked with invisible blows. Her lips whispered prayers that echoed Christ's agony. Forgiveness for sinners, love for the unlovable, surrender to the Father's will. At times, witnesses reported seeing the marks of the passion stigmata on her hands and feet, tears of blood, or a face contorted in indescribable pain. For hours she would endure this invisible crucifixion, and then, as the suffering subsided, peace would return. Her bed, soaked with sweat, became again a silent altar. The farmhouse, with its creaking beams and humble walls, had witnessed what few could believe. The Passion of Christ lived anew in a hidden mystic. Stories began to circulate of miracles connected to her prayers. Parents who begged her intercession for their dying children reported healings. Farmers who sought her blessing before planting spoke of unexpected harvests. And priests who came discouraged or doubting left her bedside renewed in faith, some going on to become founders of new communities or movements within the church. One story tells of a young priest who was wavering in his vocation. He visited Marthe, expecting to offer comfort. Instead, he left in tears, telling others, "I went to console her, but it was she who consoled me." That priest went on to lead a flourishing ministry, convinced that Marthe's hidden prayers had given him the courage to continue. Another account recalls pilgrims arriving at her home with skepticism. They whispered that it was impossible for someone to live without food. But after sitting in her presence for only a few minutes, they felt a peace so profound that doubts melted away. One visitor later said, "It was as if heaven had opened in that little room." For Marthe, however, these things were not for her glory. She never claimed the title of saint, never boasted of miracles. She called herself only the little Marthe, an unworthy servant. To her, every healing, every conversion, every answered prayer was simply the mercy of God, flowing through the cracks of her own brokenness. Cinematically, the contrast is striking. Outside, France was rushing into modernity, wars, ideologies, the collapse of faith in many places. Inside, in a single dim room, a blind and paralyzed woman, fed only by the Eucharist, was quietly shaping souls and rekindling faith. Doctors could not explain it. Skeptics dismissed it. But the fact remained. For 50 years, Marthe took no food, no drink, only communion. And during those 50 years, thousands came to her door. Bishops, priests, villagers, even future popes. Each left with the same impression. They had met someone who carried the mystery of God in her flesh. The Eucharist sustained her. The cross defined her. And the quiet miracles that surrounded her life whispered a truth that words cannot fully capture. Marthe Robin was a living sign of the supernatural, hidden in plain sight. And yet, astonishingly, her mission was only beginning. Because from her darkened bed, Marthe would become the co-founder of a worldwide movement, one that continues to this day. By the 1930s, whispers of Marthe Robin's life had spread beyond her village. First it was local priests, then bishops, and eventually theologians and leaders from across France. They came up the narrow path to the Robin farmhouse, not out of curiosity alone, but because something in Marthe's hidden suffering drew them like a magnet. The scene was always the same. A simple peasant house, creaking doors, the smell of wood smoke. Then, the hush as they entered her room. There she lay, frail, blind, motionless yet fully present, as though every fiber of her being was alive to the souls before her. What struck visitors most was her listening. Marthe had no university education, no training in philosophy or theology. Yet when priests unburdened their doubts or leaders shared their struggles, she responded with clarity that pierced to the core. Some described it as if she could read their hearts. Others said her words felt less like advice and more like revelation. One young priest named Georges Finot came to her in 1936. He had expected to meet a pious invalid. Instead, he found a prophet. That conversation changed his life, and together they founded the Foyers de Charité, homes of charity. The concept was simple but radical. Lay communities, centered on prayer, the Eucharist, and formation, where men and women could come to rekindle their faith. These foyers multiplied quickly, spreading across France, then into Europe, Africa, Asia, and beyond. Today, they exist in more than 40 countries, and it all began in a darkened room with a bedridden woman who never left her village. Imagine it cinematically. The camera pans from her narrow bed to a map of the world, pins spreading outward like light breaking into darkness. The contrast is almost unbelievable, a woman who could not move beyond four walls, igniting a movement that circled the globe. Her mission, however, was not limited to founding communities. Marthe became a spiritual compass for thousands of individuals. Bishops sought her counsel before making decisions. Priests on the brink of despair came to her and left renewed. Laypeople struggling in their faith discovered in her words a reason to hope again. Testimonies abound. One priest came burdened by his failures and confessed that he no longer believed his ministry had meaning. Marthe, blind and bedridden, told him with quiet certainty, "Offer it all. Nothing is lost when it is given to God." That priest went on to become a missionary who touched countless lives. Another story tells of a couple who visited her, torn apart by betrayal and ready to separate. Marthe listened, then spoke gently of forgiveness, of rebuilding trust, of love stronger than wounds. Against all odds, the couple reconciled. Years later, they would testify that their marriage survived only because of the words spoken by the saint in bed. Even figures of global significance sought her presence. Jean Guiton, the renowned French philosopher and friend of Pope Paul Roman VI, visited her often and described her as a witness of the invisible. Future popes, including John Paul Roman II, were aware of her and her influence on the French Church. What makes this astonishing is how hidden it all was. Marthe never traveled. She never stood at a pulpit. She never published a book. Her sermons were whispers. Her classroom was her room. Her stage was her bed. And yet, through this paradox, she became one of the most influential mystics of the 20th century. Some even said she bore France itself on her shoulders. In the years of war and occupation, she prayed constantly for her country. Visitors recalled her describing visions of France's destiny, the struggles it would face, and the light it was still called to bring to the world. She became, in a way, not just a mystic for her village, but an intercessor for a nation, and miracles continued to be reported. People who asked for her intercession spoke of healings, conversions, reconciliations. Always discreet, she would deflect any credit. "It is God who does these things. I am nothing." The hidden mission of Marthe Robin cannot be measured in statistics or headlines. It is measured in the countless souls she touched, the vocations she encouraged, the communities she helped birth, and the silent renewal of faith she inspired. Cinematically, the imagery is striking. A narrow farmhouse room, dark except for a candle and crucifix. A stream of visitors, from farmers in muddy boots to bishops in cassocks, all kneeling beside the same bed. A frail woman, her voice soft, her eyes blind, her body motionless, yet her words carrying the force of destiny. By the 1970s, Marthe Robin was known throughout France as a living mystic. Yet she remained exactly as she had always been, hidden, humble, self-effacing. If people called her a saint, she dismissed it. If they praised her wisdom, she insisted it was God alone who spoke. Her mission was clear: to be nothing, so that God could be everything. And in that nothingness, she became a fountain of life for the world. But all missions, even hidden ones, must one day come to an end. And as the 1980s approached, Marthe Robin's long journey of suffering and prayer was drawing to its close. By the late 1970s, Marthe Robin had lived through decades of silence and suffering. She had counseled thousands, founded a movement, and become a hidden spiritual beacon for France. Yet her room remained as it always had been, a narrow space, dimly lit, centered on a crucifix. Her health, already fragile, grew weaker with the years. Friends noticed that her voice, once steady though faint, now trembled. The weight of 50 years of immobility bore down on her frail body. And yet, the peace in her face never wavered. If anything, as her strength faded, her serenity deepened. In early February of 1981, the moment of departure came. There were no great crowds, no final speeches. She simply slipped quietly from this world to the next, in the same hiddenness that had defined her life. She was 78 years old. For half a century, she had been blind, paralyzed, and sustained only by the Eucharist. And for half a century, she had turned that suffering into light for others. News of her death spread quickly. Pilgrims who had visited her wept. Priests who had been counseled by her offered masses of thanksgiving. The foyers de charité, the communities she had inspired, mourned their spiritual mother. For many, it felt as though a great flame had been extinguished. And yet, as with all true saints, her death was not the end. It was the beginning of something larger. In the years that followed, testimonies multiplied. People spoke of prayers answered through her intercession. Broken families healed, sick bodies restored, faith rekindled. Others testified simply that reading her words or recalling her story gave them courage to endure their own crosses. The foyers de charité grew steadily, carrying her vision into the future. What began as a conversation in a darkened room spread into dozens of countries, touching lives across continents. In retreat houses and communities from Africa to Asia, Marthe's hidden voice continued to echo. The church, too, took notice. Investigations into her life began. Her writings, though few, were studied. Eyewitness accounts were gathered. Doctors reviewed the astonishing claim that she had lived for 50 years without food or water. Priests testified to her stigmata, her prophetic insights, and the supernatural peace that surrounded her. In 2014, Pope Francis declared Marthe Robin venerable, recognizing her heroic virtue. It was a formal acknowledgement of what thousands had long believed, that in this hidden woman, God had revealed His glory in a unique way. Still, mysteries remain. How did she survive without nourishment? Was it a medical impossibility or a miracle? What exactly happened during those Friday ecstasies when her body seemed to mirror the passion of Christ? These questions linger, unanswerable by science alone. And yet, perhaps the mystery is the point. Marthe Robin's life was not meant to provide proof for the skeptical. It was meant to reveal that even in weakness, even in obscurity, God can transform a life into a beacon of hope. Her story is not the tale of a heroine who conquered the world with power. It is the story of a woman who allowed herself to be conquered by love. Today, pilgrims still visit her village. They walk the same narrow road, enter the same farmhouse, and sit in the same room where Marthe lived. The bed is empty now, but the atmosphere remains. Visitors describe feeling a strange peace, as though her prayers still linger in the walls. Some kneel in silence. Others weep quietly. All leave with the same impression, that they have stepped into the presence of a mystery larger than themselves. For those who suffer, Marthe's life is a message. Suffering is not the end. For those who doubt, her witness is a challenge. Even in the darkest night, faith can burn like fire. And for the world, her story is a reminder that the greatest revolutions often begin not in palaces or parliaments, but in hidden rooms where souls surrender everything to God. As the credits of her life roll, one image remains: a frail woman, blind and paralyzed, lying in a farmhouse bed, her lips moving in silent prayer. A woman who ate nothing, drank nothing for 50 years, except the bread of heaven. The world barely noticed her while she lived, but heaven noticed. And through her hidden sacrifice, the light of God spread to the ends of the earth.